Hello and welcome to the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education series, Learning About Learning. We are delighted today to have the opportunity to learn from Cantor Laura Stein, LCSW. Laura, I so enjoyed reading your work, and I really am looking forward to and grateful for this opportunity to ask you questions and engage in discussion about the research that you did. The article that we will be discussing today is called Student Perspectives um, at a Jewish Pluralistic Seminary, a Qualitative Study. And one of the great sort of spaces that is created in learning about learning is a chance not only to read a scholar's work, but to then sort of pull back the curtain and get to ask some of the questions that didn't get fully into the article. And so we are grateful for that. And again, Laura, if there's anything that you want to open with in framing um, what this article is about for our audience, please do that. And then I'm going to ask you a series of questions.
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me. The joy really is mine to be able to talk about this work. I know as scholars, sometimes we feel like we write and we send it out and we don't know where it goes, but to have these conversations is such a gift. And in terms of framing, I will say from a meta perspective, so much of this work, of this research is about chavruta, is about this idea of partnering and finding meaning in the space between. And so I think on a meta perspective, we're kind of having like a parallel process here of being able to talk about that process by doing it together.
Great. So I'm sure that everyone here at the end of this conversation is going to be dying to read the article. But for anyone who didn't yet read the article, I just want to orient you and situate you within this work. Laura, with a number of co-authors, had the chance to speak to students in a pluralistic Jewish seminary and to ask them a series of questions about their spiritual practices and their learning, and the answers that she found and the analysis that she applied to their answers using her own sort of edict coding, so that she wasn't only repeating back what they said, but she was really hearing what they said and hearing themes across what they said that went beyond their actual words and perhaps even what they were able to articulate was so fascinating. So we're going to get into like the deep insights for seminaries and for adult education and for spiritual education. But first, I just want to start from the beginning. How did this project come to be?
Yeah, so this project, so the administrative leadership over at Hebrew College was launching this interest, this project in spiritual formation. So they received a 3-year grant through the Covenant Foundation to investigate spiritual formation in their seminary and to understand how they could continue to develop this program. So they kind of found their way to us. They started reading about the relational spirituality model, which my colleague, Dr. Stephen Sandage, created with a team of folks to understand the ways that people relate to the sacred. And we'll probably get into that more a little bit later. But this model that's really been developed, used in other religious settings. And so the administrative leadership over at Hebrew College had read some of that work, had found their way over to us. And at the same time, there was this other process going on where I was also applying to work in this same field. And Dr. Sandage was looking to expand the work that they had been doing in these Christian settings out into to reach other kind of inner religious spaces. And so this team came together, this grant was underway. And so we were brought in to do the research in addition to many other components of this project that they were doing. But we were brought in to do this research. And so we ended up over there doing some workshops with the faculty as well as with the students, doing data collection, obviously, which is the basis for this article, doing some talks over there, some meetings, getting feedback from the students, and really making this collaborative project that happened over the last few years.
And on your own research team, did you sort of see yourself as cultural translator, or how was sort of your own role as a cantor, as well as, of course, your academic training? How did you navigate that on your own research team?
It's funny you use the word translator. There was a lot of translation going on. This work so far in spiritual formation has been so much dominated by the Christian scholars. They've really just taken this project underway. And so I think there was like this bi-directional translation going on. From my perspective, it was learning a lot from Dr. Standage about these words, which you'll probably hear about later in the talk, but things like virtue development that he was using. And I'd say, I think we call that tikkun midot. So learning from him, oh, virtue development, okay. And then providing a phrase that was more culturally appropriate for the Jewish setting. And so we were both doing that, learning from him. I think we might call this that. And he might say, I think you might, we might explain this as this, and going to Hebrew College. And again, making this a really collaborative process to then say, how do you think about this here? Does this framework make sense for you? And then again, iterating it together to make sure that it fit their context specifically. But yes, the word translator, I think, has become one of my hats over the years.
Wow. That's so interesting that it's dominated by Christian scholarship and Christian scholars. And that really, because one of the tools of data collection that you most write about in this particular article is a survey, um, terminology matters, right? So that whether you say how often are you happy or how often you feel joy is going to get at very different phenomenon and responses. So as you're developing this survey that you give to the students of Hebrew College, how are you negotiating the language on that survey?
So the survey was developed based on this Christian experience. And again, I want to clarify, when I said dominated by, I didn't mean that the Christians kind of took it over from anyone. I mean that they really had a big hand in developing a lot of the frameworks that we're using. We, on the Jewish side, have certainly there's been research published over the decades, but it's been slower to develop. It's been a little less in depth. Obviously, our project is hoping to restart an interest in some of this work in this field. But in terms of the design of the survey, we took some of what was learned in these Christian seminaries, specifically that there was a diverse experience among seminary students about their spiritual formation. Some people struggled, some people flourished, some people struggled and flourished in various ways that differed from their classmates. They found really through this research that the capacities for healthy relational development, emotional regulation, virtues, all of these things were really important for the well-being and the growth and the formation of these students. And so building off of some of that research that we're so grateful to be able to have inherited from the Christian scholars, we said, okay, well, a lot of this is likely to be happening too in this Jewish context and in Jewish seminaries more broadly. And so we brought some of our ideas about the diversity of experience, trying to understand from students what capacities they're relying on internally, what external resources they're using. We brought some ideas to the seminary, again, just based on this prior research. And they helped us, again, to iterate this process. So we came with a few ideas that they gave us some feedback on. This might resonate a little bit better. And then some terms weren't so well known. So for example, relational spirituality or the relational spirituality model has really only been used in these other contexts. And so when I was discussing earlier these workshops, we went in and gave some talks to the students and the faculty to say, here's really what we're talking about. And so they were a little bit primed or educated to understand in the conceptualization of what formation really meant to us. And I just want to throw, if it's okay, throw this in here because I know we haven't really defined formation. So when we talk about spiritual formation, we're talking about multidimensional processes of growth that happens to a person based in their values. Those might be spiritual or otherwise, intentions, ultimate concerns, various things that they derive from their identity and from their experiences in their community. And so what we were doing in this formation survey was trying to understand spiritual, theological, psychological, emotional, relational development, all these types of growth that happen for people while they're in graduate school, understanding what led students there, what was happening for their formation in school, both on campus and off campus, and then, of course, looking to the future. How could the students partner with the seminary and vice versa to better meet the needs of how these clergy were looking to be trained for the demanding and changing roles that clergy have today?
Awesome. And I'm gonna, when you're interviewed by a fellow social scientist, I geek out on methods questions, but I know that we have a broad audience and they're like, ask her about the demands of today. But I have to, so audience, stay with me. I want to ask one more methods question. So in this sort of this complicated construct of spiritual formation, and you're doing a survey, what is the validity of self-report? In other words, who's to say that these kids, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way, and I appreciate that the age range is large at Hebrew College, but who's to say that these rabbis in training are accurate reporters of their own spiritual growth? That's a very complicated construct. Why do we trust them and not, say, their spouse or their children or their partner as reporters?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I just want to start by saying, as a Cantor, I appreciate that you called me a social scientist because I've newish to this field. We don't have to get into my bio necessarily, but was trained as a Cantor and a social worker, and am now trying to kind of combine the spiritual and the practical, or the behavioral and the belief. So the word social scientist, thank you for trusting me with that title. Yeah,
Sure.
I mean, it's a really interesting question. I don't know that I haven't, have to admit, I haven't really thought about that. I think that I'll start by saying this, that there's and maybe we'll get to this also a little bit later when you talk about what seminaries can be doing. But I think one of the things that we really learn through this process is that students really do have a great sense of what their vulnerabilities are, what their strengths are coming in. But I mean, I was in seminary for 5 years. It's a very long time, especially if you go from your early 20s to late 20s, or mid 20s to, early 30s. There's a lot of growth that's bound to happen during that time developmentally. And so students come in with a great sense, I mean, a real instinct about their growth edges, what they feel like their strengths are, but we're really looking to rely on the system to be able to help them. I don't know that romantic partners, maybe in a future study that would be very interesting. I actually am a co-author on another paper about, in a Christian setting, about a very similar question. But in this setting, the question about how are students conceptualizing this, I think we really envision the seminary and all of the ripples out from the seminary to be partners in this work. So for example, student pulpits, a supervisor there who is likely to be a rabbi or a cantor who also went through seminary training, to be able to be a part of that formation and to say, we are all working on it as a team to provide outside perspectives and feedback. Because you're right, the students come in with a sense, but A, a lot of change and growth happens during that time. And B, we all have obviously blind spots and things that we can benefit from seeing through other people's eyes. So in terms of a validity perspective, I would say the way that we approach this methodologically is that we used reflexive thematic analysis, which is this type of method, a qualitative method that really relies on the data that comes from, that relies on the kind of the validity of the data itself. So we were really pulling information from the students themselves, and in a longitudinal setting where we could revisit this, which we are, and we can talk about that later, we would be able to see how things might change over time as students learn more about other frameworks that might be able to integrate into their own view of themselves.
Great. Okay. So, Cantor, social scientist, Laura Stein, people want to know, what did you find?
What did we find? Yeah, so we found a lot. There was a wide range of results in this study. So I won't go through all of them because they're in the paper and we have limited time. But I will say that we broke the results into 3 categories. So when people are thinking about their spiritual formation, these were all rabbinic students because of the program we were working with, that there was on-campus things that were happening related to the seminary, off-campus things related to the seminary, and then off-campus that was not related to the seminary. I'll give you some examples. So we found that seminary culture, what was going on in the community, was super important. That students said this container where they feel this shared mission with their cohort, where they can build relationships and belong, was super important for them. Students mentioned the impact of, for example, living in Israel. They also requested new things. So we're not surprised by that. They were requesting training in social sciences, mental health competency, different forms of justice training, learning about, for example, Musar, ways to develop personal character strengths from a Jewish perspective, a little more pastoral care in very specific ways, history and American Jewry. So lots of kind of academic curriculum expansion that they were looking for to build off of the strengths of the program as well that were already there. Students love tefillah. I'm not surprised as a cantor who trained in a very musical setting. Tefillah and the idea of praying with your community connection was strengthening connection to God, to self, also to the sense of belonging. And then students requested time for processing, which we also weren't super surprised about. This idea that students said, the experience is great, but I want to be able to learn from what's happening. And they already had these things called formation slots at Hebrew College, but students asked for, could we have different types of processing in those groups, like talking more about God or halacha or personal practice. We also learned that students wanted unstructured time with faculty to learn outside the classroom and just form relationships. Students wanted more seminars, other things. I will just put in here that it's funny as I'm listing all these things that students were asking for. There's this line in the data that sticks out to me where one student said in all caps, no more stuff with like 5 exclamation points. So we always are thinking about this dialectic of more and also like there is some, too much of a good thing. We don't want to overload students to the point where they're not really able to integrate any of this or internalize any of it. So always looking at this balance between what's going really well, but what students want more of, and also how to give students some freedom to craft their own process and know their own limits. Just some other things that came out of the research. This idea, like I said earlier, that Chavruta, this relational space for connection and text study, and learning virtue, like listening and humility, learning to argue or debate in a healthy way, to repair ruptures that might happen interpersonally, to co-construct meaning or learn new meaning. This came up in a really big way as well. And students also named, wouldn't it be great to learn more of this? Humility, compassion, self-regulation outside of the Chavruta setting. Like I said, justice, diversity came up a lot. Dismantling systems of oppression was something that came up a bunch as well. And then in terms of these kind of offsite things, people endorsed spiritual direction, clinical pastoral education, or CPE as being really valuable, their field work as being really valuable. And then students also, again, probably not surprisingly, talked about things that really didn't have to do with the school, but that fed back into their experience. So things like investing in psychotherapy privately on their own, having their own spiritual practice as a Jew in the pew instead of as being a leader on Shabbat, and just, restfulness, mindfulness, restorative practices like biking and journaling and other things that they did either on Shabbat or otherwise. So as you can see, it's a wide range of results, but some things surprising, some things not as surprising.
What was most surprising?
It's a great question. I had a feeling you were going to ask me this, and I thought about this. What was most surprising? I'll say 2 things. The first thing that was, I think, pretty surprising to me, there's this adage, I don't know if people have heard this before, but there's this adage, if you want to talk about God, don't go to seminary. I don't know if people have heard about that. Somehow God can get lost. We reference God, we might invoke God in certain ways, but we're not always really wrestling or talking about God. The divine in various forms was just kind of woven throughout all of the data in a way that made me feel really hopeful, I think, about this integrative kind of formation that we were looking for, that students talked about themselves and talked about their communities, but integrated what that might look like in terms of attachment, right? I feel super attached to my community, but I feel like God might be abandoning me. And we were really interested in kind of the behavioral or human or relational things that were going on developmentally here. So the introduction or the weaving of God or the divine was surprising because I wasn't necessarily expecting as integrated of some of these responses. I was also surprised by the prevalence of requests for what we would call seeking in this work. So the relational spirituality model talks about dwelling, which is this anchored sense of what's familiar, and then seeking, which is this permission, this comfort with things that are unfamiliar and new things and questions and doubt. And so we were really interested and surprised by this idea that students felt so comfortable, so safe, so secure in their Jewish identity that were really requesting interfaith work, work in, in things that maybe they weren't as familiar with. And I was, I guess, surprised because I think it implied a real sense of groundedness in Judaism, that there was this permission or this willingness or this real desire to also seek interdisciplinary work, new work outside.
So, you had mentioned that earlier in our discussion that it's a particular moment to be in seminary. I'm going to ask you about the implications of the work, but I think it's helpful to first sort of articulate what is a moment in your mind.
What's a moment? Well, I think the obvious thing is the justice landscape, the social justice landscape that we are all living in, religious leaders and otherwise, just as people in society. People are becoming more civically minded in a way that, I mean, we're coming off of this, giant protest, national protest, actually international protest from Saturday, from this past Shabbat. And this idea that a critical consciousness is kind of prevailing here, that we are oriented towards not just what do these justice ideas mean theoretically or theologically, but what does it mean to be agents of justice, especially if you're in a leadership position and there's people looking to you to lead the way. So I think that in this moment, and it's not to say that there haven't always been, highly charged justice contexts for education, but I think right now we're living through a very specific time. So I think number one, right now religious leadership is highly charged in that way, and that people do expect, especially Judaism with this really long-standing and rich tradition of justice work, expecting Jewish leaders to be well-trained in that. So I think that's number one. Number two is what I will say is that I think probably people on this call can relate to this, is that rabbis, cantors, religious leaders might at one time have been kind of the communal guru, the leader of everything. And over time, we have access to psychotherapy, to yoga, to life coaches, to various communities, relationships, contexts, or resources that might be able to help us. And so I think we have this debate of, are religious leaders supposed to try to become all of those things as well, so that we can be the first point of contact, so that people come to us first, and then we can perhaps guide them on, best courses of action afterwards? Or are we really meant to just come back to, we are religious leaders, we transmit Jewish tradition, there are really, well-trained psychotherapists who can help with more behavioral change or other things like that? I think that's a question. I don't have an answer to that. I'm a person with a pastoral degree. I'm ordained, but I also have a master of social work. So I can speak to some of my own struggle of which hat am I wearing. But I think right now we are trying to understand in seminaries, with all of this stuff that people want, and also this push for no more stuff, also, partnered or coupled with this idea that we want to be able to retain this expertise. Religious leaders are experts in text and music and transmitting cultural heritage and tradition and ritual. Do we really want to, double down on this? Or are we interested also in what it might look like to be focusing also on who the religious leader is? And I just want to spend just briefly a few minutes or a minute talking about this idea that the development, the spiritual formation that we're talking about has to do with the way that students interact with their ritual, their God belief, all these other things. But also this new interest in the formation of the vessel. So if a cantor, a rabbi, is a vessel for transmitting this tradition, we might argue that the vessel itself is just as important, how that person was formed, their own relationship to these things, when they're leading other people's spiritual experiences or guiding other people's spiritual experiences. So I think, just to kind of add that I think the spiritual formation stuff that we're talking about is a new orientation, or this added layer about training these rabbis and cantors not just to be very knowledgeable and very skilled in the various pedagogies that we expect our religious leaders to be skilled in or knowledgeable in, but also that person is in a kind of co-constructive process with themselves, with their community, with other people in their lives. In this case, they're, seminary faculty and administrators, and that there's like an iterative process or an evaluative process going on. I will just add that for seminary, one of the things that some of the research has surfaced is this idea that, we kind of check in with students over time, but there might not be like a real formal evaluation process. And how cool would it be if students came in and, in the first year said, this is what I'm coming in with. I think it would be great to learn this, to unlearn this, to develop this. And then that the seminary would partner over time, relying on frameworks, whether it's the relational spirituality model or other things that make sense for that context, to in relationship with faculty, with whomever it is, with each other, really, with the peers as well, to be able to, in relationship, help that student to develop. So I think that additional focus, in addition to the justice, in addition to these pedagogical questions, is that the word?
Pedagogical?
Pedagogical. Sorry, I've been talking now for 25 minutes. Pedagogical questions. The additional layer of what does it mean for also the person to be developing themselves and have that be a process of their spiritual experience too.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I think I hear you saying that while sort of I like the language of vessel in the sense of, well, charisma has obviously is not a new phenomenon in religious leadership. Um, it sounds like the model you're working in, tell me if I'm saying this back to you accurately, is trying to shift from charisma to sort of authenticity or toho kavaro, as we would say, that what it means to be a vessel is not just to perform, but to really sort of to actually
Embody, I
participate
think.
and
Yeah. Not just
embody.
say
Yeah.
embody. Yeah. Yeah. One of our colleagues, Wendy Rossoff, she, about 20 years ago, she wrote her dissertation and coined this term, maybe not coined, but really brought back this term clay kodesh, making not just vessels, but holy vessels. The idea that, you know, anybody or any book can transmit knowledge. The question is there a holy process going on of that transmission, of that passing down, of that praying in community, of that being Jewish in community process that's holy? And again, you had asked us this early about definitions and what are we using and how are we trusting people's different, self-identifications. The word holy, we could obviously talk at length about and different definitions of, but I think in our specific project here, we're concerned with and really interested by the idea that holy has to do with the relational component and the developmental component of things. So what's happening for people as they grow? How are they sharing that with others? The ability, the capacity, really the richness and the potential for things like humility, compassion, forgiveness, patience, hope, vitality, all these different virtues that we expect of people and say, I want to learn from my clergy people. I want to be guided by them through different life cycles. And it also matters to me the health of our relationship and how we are together. And so we're kind of, again, in this formation, looking at the whole person, not just how they learn things, how much they're learning, how well they perform certain clergy roles, but how they are in relationship with God, with the ritual, with the history, and of course, with themselves and with others.
Great. You won't believe it, but we're almost done with our half hour of getting to sort of dig deep, but I found it like an incredibly just clarifying and inspiring conversation because the article itself was quite lovely to read. But you sort of talking us through it and really focusing on this idea that that the model that you're working out of is one in which I'm gonna put my own language on it, and I invite everyone listening to sort of put the language that works for them, but is really trying to move from performance to vessel.
Yeah.
Um,
And I'll just add, if you don't mind, the Jewish research is really just, I think, beginning to pick up again, that there's been so much contribution over the years, but it's getting deeper, I think, as we try to understand these things in modern context. So I hope everybody will stay tuned. We're doing more research at Hebrew College, but also in various other seminaries, and really hoping to make a big contribution here to help students, but also future Jewish communities.
Fabulous. And let me just pin you down on that one because there was a lot of interest in the chat. You are doing more research. Tell us where we can find it.
Sure. We are on the precipice of publishing a follow-up study at Hebrew College about spiritual changes and struggles after the war, during and after the war, of religious leaders wrestling with the socio-political context that we're living in, especially in Israel. That should be out in the next few months. Don't hold me to that, but sometime in the next near future. We're also working right now with Yeshivat Maharat, the Orthodox Women's Seminary in New York. That should be also within the year. And again, if you stay in touch with the Danielson Institute at Boston University, or you can message me, of course, through the various websites that have my contact information, be happy to share articles, make them open access to you, of course, and also to stay in touch as this research becomes published.
Fabulous. We're so grateful for you joining us here at the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education. We love bringing scholars who we don't have direct contact with already, and it's so clear that our interests overlap. We hope that you will stay in touch with us, and we invite everybody here to please look at our center event page to see all of the exciting upcoming events and conversations and scholarship, and to listen to Laura speak again as we turn this into a podcast where you'll be able to go at 1.5 or zero point 0.5, depending on your preference. Laura, thank you so, so much for joining us in our Mandel Center community today. It was such a privilege and a thoughtful experience to learn from you.
You as well. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Take care.